And a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me, as always, this week are Janis Emmanouilidis, the EPC's Director of Studies, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg. Morning, gentlemen. Our guest this week, joining us later on to discuss the EU recovery plan and its updated industrial strategy, will be welcoming policy analysts Frederico, Mollet and Marta, Pilati. As always, totally interactive discussion, questions from me to our speakers, and later on, I hope, from all of you. You are all muted for now. If you want to write your question, click on the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button, and write your question. And please, please, please be brief so I can see at a glance what you want to know and who you want to know it from. If you want to speak, click on the raised hands button and I will unmute you when the time comes. So we're going to start as usual by looking at the latest developments in relation to COVID-19. And Janis, perhaps I could start with you here on the controversy of the week, if we can call it that, the issue of a patent waiver. So the US deciding to go along with a proposal and support a proposal launched by India and South Africa initially to waive patents, arguing this is the way, this is the obstacle to getting more vaccines made and getting more of the developing world vaccinated. The US saying they will support it, the EU kicking back, pushing back, some cynically suggesting that this was the US trying to divert attention from its export ban, but saying this isn't the problem. What is the row about and how important is it?
I think that it is important because we all know that even if we get the situation under control in the developed world with respect to COVID-19, we will never get the situation under control if the entire world is not getting grip of the situation, if people are being vaccinated throughout the world. So initiatives like COVAX and also the discussion which we're now having is positive in terms of trying to figure out how one can bring the vaccine to the people who actually need it. Outside of Europe, outside of the Americas and so forth. But the question is how to do it. And there are questions marked with respect to the initiative taken by the Biden administration, which, by the way, come from the fact that, yes, there was information that they would come out with a proposal, but they didn't actually discuss it. They didn't want to have a prior exchange with Europeans about how to deal with that. So there was no coordination, no consultation. So the question comes up, is this something which is also to draw attention away from the fact that the US is not exporting, that there is a ban on material going out from the US, and whether this is something which relates to that, whether that has something to do also with public relations. But as we know, the subject is of a certain significance, so we need to discuss. And I think, yes, there was a critical reaction coming from the EU, coming from EU institutions, but at the same time, there was also an indication of let's discuss things. Let's discuss as to whether this is the best way of going forward, or whether there are other things which we need to do, which potentially might be more productive in terms of making sure that the vaccination is being spread throughout the world.
I mean, Fabian, the argument you hear from Angela Merkel in particular and other EU leaders, although there are some divisions on this issue, is this isn't the problem. Patents are not the obstacle. It's about increasing production. It's about exports of vaccines. And they say, in line with what the industry says, this risks stifling innovation of precisely the type that's led to these vaccines. How significant would it be, do you think, if the EU did decide to go along with this in terms of companies' attitudes towards innovating in Europe and so on? How important is this discussion more broadly?
I think it is important that there is a dialogue with the companies because in the end, it's likely that we are going to need some form of continuous innovation. Hopefully, we are going to get the virus more under control, but we already see that there are mutations, that things are changing. There are some suggestions that we might actually need to have some form of vaccination, a big vaccination. So we need to maintain the ability of companies to provide that. And that also means that there needs to be a profit in it for those companies. But I think this is a discussion which should be had. And as Janis said, it's important that we're having that discussion across the developed world, where we have the production facilities, where we have the patents.
Thank you. Having a few technical issues with you freezing, but we heard you fine. So thank you very much. And hopefully that will hold out. Janis, please do come in, but I wanted to also ask, there are some divisions. I mean, some EU leaders appeared much more open to this idea, saying, let's look at it, let's discuss it. Others, and Porto, of course, the social summit, come back to that later on, was an occasion for them to discuss it briefly. Others much more negative about the whole idea, and as I say, much more cynical about the US motives. How do you see this landing eventually?
Well, first of all, I think I wanted to add something to what we were discussing earlier, because besides all the political discussions which are happening and the question as to which way is the best way to deal with this, I think we should be aware of the fact that if you look into the production of mRNAs, so biotech, Moderna vaccines, it's not that it's one patent that you need in order to produce these things. There are around experts saying 80 to 100 patents which are necessary in order to produce these vaccines. And putting all these patents, knowledge, innovation together is something which, if you look at it from a more holistic perspective, requires companies to have the support of those who have invented these vaccinations. So you need companies like BioNTech or Pfizer and Moderna who will help you, will help drug makers, even if you waive the patents, to produce safely the vaccine. Because this is an extremely complex process, which means that you need their support. So by waiving, with a vaccine patent waiver, you might risk having their support for others to be able to produce these vaccines. So that's something I think we should not forget.
And where do you think it'll land?
I think that we will see that there will be an increasing push to find additional ways of increasing capacity, production capacity, in those, whether this is in Europe or in the US or in other parts of the Western world, but it's also being that we increase the production in other parts of the world, that there is a rise of licensing deals, which would not require a waiver. That would be one way. And then I think also that we will see that there will be an increasing pressure on the US to start exporting the vaccines which it is producing. It has reached now a vaccination level where I think it's easier also for the Biden administration to come forward with these ideas. So I think that there are other things that can be done, and the discussion which we're having on the waiver could push that. Ironically, interestingly enough, also in the US.
Okay, Malcolm Harbour commenting from the audience exactly on your point to licensing. Surely the focus should be on boosting the licensed manufacturing of vaccines. I suspect the US policy switch may be intended to energize new licensing offers from the producers. And of course, Fabian, this debate about increasing production capacity links into the broader debate. We're going to come back to this later on in our discussion on the industrial strategy about strategic autonomy. I mean, where are we with that? Thierry Breton has been tasked with finding ways to increase production capacity. I'm still wondering what role there is for the EU in doing this and what can be done.
Sorry, I'm having some real problems.
I know. Can you hear me? Or do you want to go out and come back in?
I need to go out and come back in.
Okay, well, don't worry, we'll carry on. We'll see you in a moment. Janis, can I just also ask you on the point of COVAX? Because there is, EU supported the launch of the initiative, of course, designed to ensure equitable access to the vaccine, but far fewer doses so far have been delivered than was envisaged. We're up to something, I think, like the last figure I saw was 54 million doses to 121 countries, but that's 150 million less than was envisaged. Why is that? What is the EU attitude? And I've seen also reports that some member states are doing things bilaterally rather than through COVAX. Does that matter? Is the important thing that we get the vaccines to them? How do you see the COVAX initiative playing out?
Well, I think that there are a number of reasons why the numbers are as low as the ones which you had indicated. And the original number was that we would hit a 250 million target by the end of May. So we're far away, as you were saying, from that original target. But I think that has numerous reasons for that. One is that overall production capacity had not been high enough. We've had this discussion, we all remember in January, February very vividly, of the incapacity of industry to produce more vaccines, also not sticking to its obligations, a lot of the pharmaceutical companies. So that was one of the problems. Another problem was created by the fact that the vaccines which has been distributed most in the COVAX context is AstraZeneca. And a lot of that has been or is being produced in South Korea and in India. And with the second wave in India, the local authority decided to halt exports of vaccinations for understanding reason if you look into the situation in the country, which has been dreadful. So I think that there are a number of reasons which have led to these low numbers. And the last reason I would mention also relates to something you were mentioning, that there is also question marks with respect to COVAX, whether the COVAX system will work efficiently, can work efficiently, and whether there might be other means also which Europeans could use to coordinate among member states in order to make sure that vaccines reach countries in need outside of the COVAX initiative. So yes, there still is support for it, but there are some who have raised critical voices with respect to the ability of the COVAX system to actually deliver in practice.
Thank you. And indeed, I've also seen some suggestions that some member states preferring to do it bilaterally because they feel if they do it through COVAX, they get no praise for it. And again, linking this to the patent waiver issue, this is the US is seen by some in Europe as trying to claim a sort of moral high ground where they feel it has none. So Fabian, a last comment to this and this question of ramping up production capacity, both for this crisis and in the longer term.
I think this is the important question, really, of how do we change our systems? How do we change our industrial policy to be prepared for the future? I think now we are getting to the point where certainly for the European Union, we are securing enough doses. Yes, we have to have more global production. But I think that the real question is what we do in the longer term to be better prepared for these kind of crises.
We are still having a few challenges with your sound, Fabian, but we will persist, and we're going to come back to that changing industrial policy to prepare for the future in a little while. But let me move on, and I really hope the sound will hold with us for this. Fabian, coming back to the UK, the Scottish situation. We had local elections in the UK last week. The SNP, the Independence Party in Scotland, did very well. Didn't quite get the majority it was hoping for, one short, but there is a clear pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. A fierce battle now over whether the UK will allow Scotland to have another referendum. That's the only way it would be legal. How do you see this playing out? And are we now looking at the prospect of an independent Scotland applying to the EU to rejoin sometime in the not too distant future?
I'll try without the camera.
Okay, let's do that.
The sound. Yes, we had the Scottish election, which had this SNP just falling short of an absolute majority. So 64 seats out of 129. That's quite a stunning victory because the electoral system is designed not to produce majorities. We're talking about an electoral system with disproportionate representation. So getting 64 seats out of 129 is quite an achievement. On top of that, this is the fourth time in a row that the SNP is going to form the new government. So the incumbent curse wasn't there. And both the SNP and the Greens, which together will form a majority of 72 seats, had independence a new referendum in their manifesto. So there is an argument now that there is a democratic legitimacy to have a second independence referendum after the 2014 one. But the way the constitution in the UK looks, this still has to be agreed to by London. It has to be agreed to by the UK government. which at the moment is quite adamant that they are refusing to do so. To some extent, that confrontation is going to be postponed because Nicola Sturgeon has said she does not intend to hold the independence referendum until after COVID. But I think in the next 6 months or so, we will have that discussion about whether this second independence referendum will be allowed or not, including potentially court cases where there will be a call on the Supreme Court to decide whether there is now a democratic mandate.
And your instinct, Fabian, I know it's early days, we don't even have agreement to have one, but your instinct, the polls were quite wide in favor of independence, but they have narrowed recently. Your instinct on what the outcome might be if there is another referendum. And I saw a glorious paradox suggested the other day, which is that for London, there is a real dilemma here, because all the arguments that they would make for keeping Scotland in the Union are precisely the arguments that were made to keep the UK in the European Union. So they will be, if you like, contradicting themselves in any debate to come. I don't know whether you see that irony emerging. What's your prediction, if you can make one now?
It's a very difficult question. My prediction would be that we will have a second independence referendum. I don't think it can be put off indefinitely, but the indications are that at the moment, really the Scottish population is split in the middle. We're talking about roughly 50-50 pro and against independence. So that's more pro-independence voters than we had in 2014. But it still doesn't mean that the outcome is inevitably going to be independent. And a lot will depend on the kind of arguments which are made. There will be a lot of argument around the economics of this, the nature of the border between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK. But there will also be an argument about belonging and what does the United Kingdom actually stand for in this post-Brexit world. So I think the outcome is very open. But if Scotland does become independent in a constitutional way, then I think it is inevitable that they will also join the European Union. There will be a process, it will take some time, but I cannot see that a democratic country with an advanced economy which fulfills broadly the conditions of membership could not become a member.
Philippe de Buc asks, what will be the economic consequences for Scotland if, he says, when it becomes independent? I'm going to say if it becomes independent. Is this favourable for the European Union? Would it be a good addition to the club?
I think clearly there are some transition difficulties because we are now talking about a separation between the rest of the UK and an independent Scotland. But in the longer term, if we look at the Scottish economy in terms of the assets, in terms of what it could contribute, also in terms of the EU budget, then we're talking about a prosperous, advanced economy, which would also be a net payer into the EU budget. So I think for the EU, it looks like it would be a positive one as long as Scotland is fulfilling the conditions of membership, is willing to also be a constructive part.
Yeah, very quick one, if you would, Fabian, on a question from Joe Linen, because then we need to move on. Allowing a referendum in Great Britain seems to be an arbitrary decision. We had a yes last time around to having one, now the suggestion of a no. What would the courts say on this matter? Can we predict the outcome of a court hearing on this?
We have no idea what the courts would say. There's no written constitution. There's no specific provision for this kind of referendum. So it would be an argument. I think what we are going to talk about when it comes to court cases is to some extent how the union was created over 300 years ago and what the
We were doing so well for a moment there and we've lost him.
Can union between two independent countries.
Yeah, Fabian, we're having tremendous difficulties again. I don't know whether a log off and a log back on again.
Sorry, I don't know.
No,
It happens.
We're losing you.
I'll try again.
Janis, briefly, let's turn, before we focus on the industrial strategy, let's turn to something that would, of course, be linked to it. Porto, the social summit this weekend. There was a very lofty declaration at the end of it, reaffirming the commitment to a social Europe, implementing the European Pillar of Social Rights. But in substance, how much really was achieved, if anything? What sort of message, particularly given the economic and social impact of COVID, do you think, what message has been sent to EU citizens? I was quite struck. There's a line in the declaration talking about the action plan as useful guidance, which didn't sound to me like very much a firm commitment to actually act. How do you see the outcome? How significant was it?
Well, it was not a really firm commitment. If you look into the declaration, it's, nice words, a lot of the things which we've heard in the past. Also, if you ask yourself how far we've gotten since Gothenburg in 2017, since the European Pillar of Social Rights was adopted, there's not much concrete, innovative new things in the document. It's even less ambitious than some EU leaders wanted it to be. President Michel, for example, was saying that we need to go beyond GDP, but have more of a well-being perspective on our economies. These things didn't even find their way really into the document. So not much has been moving. But I think that has to do with the fact that there are a good number of countries, a big number of countries, which do not want the EU, which do not want the Commission to have more competences when it comes to issues related to labor, employment, pension, education. There was even a letter signed by 11 member states. It included the Frugal Four, but not only them, also the Finnish, the Baltics, Malta, Ireland, Bulgaria signed a letter saying that, that the EU should, warning in effect Lisbon and Brussels, to respect national policy making in these areas, not to go beyond where we are with respect to the current state of affairs. So there is strong opposition in the Council, in the European Council, with respect to having a stronger social Europe. But on the other hand, we all know that especially the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, has led to an increasing level of disparities within member states, between member states. Certain groups have proven to be very vulnerable, the young ones, also female citizens. So there's an increasing pressure, but the member states are still not ready to surrender their prerogatives.
Exactly. We do have another couple of questions come in on Scotland. I'm not going to take them now because we need to move on. If we have time at the end, we'll come back on them. But Fabian, did you want to say 2 words about Porto before I bring Frederico and Marta in to talk about recovery plans, industrial strategy et al.?
Yeah, just to say that I think it is a bit disappointing that we can't have a wider discussion on this, given the impact COVID-19 is going to have, because what we are going to see, what we are already seeing to some extent, is a widening of disparities, both between countries and within countries. And we are going to have a very differentiated impact. It might be the same crisis, but it is not the same impact. And we've already seen that the impact on certain groups, for example, women, is much worse than on the rest of the population. So I think this is something where we actually need to think very carefully about how we construct the recovery so that it is more equitable. And I think that is part of what we also have to discuss in the context of the recovery plans.
Which segues beautifully in where we're going to go next, because in that declaration, it also refers, and I'm quoting, to a commitment to a collective, inclusive, timely and cohesive recovery. Let's bring in our 2 experts on this topic, Frederico Mollet and Marta Pilati, to join our discussion. A very warm welcome to Update to both of you. And let's start where Fabian just finished with the recovery plans. And Marta, if I could come to you first. In terms of the recovery and resilience plans, we now have, I don't know whether all member states have now submitted them. They were supposed to do so by the end of last month, but many have. What is the assessment? Where are we with this? And what is the assessment really of how, to what extent these national plans really can spur the economic recovery, and indeed that it will be collective, inclusive, timely, cohesive, to use those words from the declaration. Where are we in the process?
Thanks. Well, just first a clarification. Indeed, not all countries have submitted their plans. 13 are still missing, so we're just above half.
Wow.
As you said, the soft deadline, as this commission has called it, was the 30th of April, so that's well past. But during the last months, I think the commission has been very clear that this was not a hard deadline at all, and even encouraged some of the countries that might need more time to take it, which is what has been happening. So we might see that some of the plans might still come in this month or even later, should that be required. Just a clarification, this doesn't mean that the process will be delayed, because the commissions will assess the plans on a rolling basis. So they've been, every plan will follow its own schedule. From what we can see, though, of what has been already published or submitted, I think the plans are quite good basis, and I think the framework that had been put in place, the objectives are all there. So I would say that my assessment is on paper, the plans look very good. And this is also, of course, thanks to the continuous dialogue that has been for months going on between the Commission and the countries, so that, of course, the plans are the best version possible. So I think on paper, this look very good. Although, of course, well, on paper, the objectives are there, but then one should see what implementation will look like.
Can I just follow up on that, though? You say the delay, it doesn't necessarily mean a delay, but nevertheless, I mean, the time this whole process of getting these plans in shape, of getting the money beginning to flow out, it is taking an inordinate amount of time. Do you believe, therefore, that this isn't going to be, how do you see the impact of all of this? Will it be genuinely, as we've seen in the US, with a sort of, huge impulse to the economy, huge stimulus to the economy in the short term? Or do you now see this as more of a long-term tool for rebuilding economies in a more sustainable way, taking account of the green and the digital? Is it a short-term injection, or much more should we be looking to the long term, do you think?
I think, first of all, we should not misunderstand the recovery plans as a crisis response mechanism. They are not a crisis response. That has already been happening in 2020, and those are different mechanisms. The recovery plans are for the recovery. So they have indeed a medium-term horizon, but I think they also can have an immediate impact when it comes to confidence and kickstarting the rebound. Why? Because even if they are not there yet, so the funding is not there yet, the member states could, and some have already started implementing the measures. This is because the funding can be used retroactively. So even for measures that have already been started, they can then be reimbursed with the EU funding at a later stage. So there is scope for achieving both objectives, which is providing a short-term kick to the economy while putting in place measures that have a medium-term impact.
Thank you. I'm going to get an assessment from all of you now of where we are. Frederico, would you echo, I mean, Marta, there actually a positive assessment. The plans that we do have look good, and even if it's not the short-term stimulus, it is important, could help to start the rebound. Would you agree with that analysis?
I would agree with it. I mean, I would say, however, that the US example, I think, is a really good one, because not only is the total stimulus amount significantly bigger than what we're seeing in the EU, according to most assessments that we have out there, including the resilience and recovery funds and national measures. But there's a kind of historical reason why the US went for its stimulus package in the way that it did, with lots of direct payments directly to consumers and citizens. Because back in the beginning of Obama's first term, when he was responding to the 2008 crisis, they did try and go for a kind of infrastructure stimulus investment plan, and at the time there was a mantra from Obama about finding shovel-ready projects that were ready to invest in to improve long-term growth and also provide an immediate stimulus. And then he was quoted a few years later saying that there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project. So even though there is an immediate stimulus effect that will come from this funding, I think the fact remains that making these kinds of long-term structural investments, whether they're infrastructural or maybe more into the social fabric, take time to come online. And so there are challenges of getting the money out of the door quickly and efficiently. And I mean, we've seen it from the fact that 13 of the plans are late. Just designing effective investment programs is challenging, and it will be challenging to implement them as well. So I think that we will continue to see a requirement for maybe short-term stimulus measures that will fall on national balance sheets. And that's even before we get to the question of the overall size of the stimulus compared to the US one. Because we've seen assessments from macroeconomists saying that it doesn't come up to the output gap that we're seeing from the EU. So whether it's sufficient or whether the large private savings that people have accumulated during the crisis will be enough to kickstart the recovery, I think still remains to be seen. But I mean, I think it will definitely have a positive impact on the long-term growth trend of the EU.
Fabian, your assessment of where we are. You've talked often about the importance of the changed reality of a post-COVID world, and those structural issues that we're going to face. Do you agree with Frederico and Marta that in their relatively positive assessment of the impact it can have?
I think certainly this funding, these programs will have a positive impact, particularly once they are on the ground, once we are seeing the money being spent. I think the question for me is, will it be enough in the longer term? And that has a lot to do with the nature of the crisis and the structural changes which will come with this crisis, the nature of competition, what will happen with a number of different sectors. I think at the moment we're seeing that in a sense there's an experiment of how much demand will come back for certain sectors. If it doesn't come back, there will have to be shifts in employment, shifts in investment. So for me, I think we are at the start of a process rather than at the end. And we will need, in my view, to continue adjusting what we do to that reality. I think what we also don't know is whether this is going to be a swift recovery. We are going to see a certain amount of rebound, which is going to happen simply because we're opening up again. But beyond the rebound, are we going to see a sustained recovery, growth returning to pre-crisis level? Or are we going to see stagnation or even decline? All of this, I think, is still open. And if we do see a development towards a more negative economy, then we will have to do more.
Janis?
Well, first of all, I think let's imagine for a second we wouldn't have the Next Generation EU. If we wouldn't be talking about having national plans being funded, co-funded by European money, we would be finding ourselves in a totally different situation now. So what Marta was saying earlier, that this in itself is providing a basis of trust with respect to potential economic development is something I think which is fundamental. So if we wouldn't have had it, I think the negative effect would have been immense. So now we can complain whether it's enough, whether actually it will suffice or not, and we can discuss whether that's the case. And there are good reasons to believe that potentially it might not be enough. And I think that there will be an intense discussion about that at some point in time, not now, at some point in time, where I'm skeptical as to whether member states will be ready to add to what has been decided in 2020 at some point. However, having it, I think, is an immense opportunity and is something which is extremely positive. Second point, I think that you will see in a good number of member states that it will make a difference. And that relates to something which I think both Marta and Frederico were saying, which is, yes, you're now in the conceptual phase, you need to get it through, to get the agreement, Commission, Council, but then you need to implement it. So it will be key how these plans will actually be implemented in practice on the ground in each and every member state, where I think it makes sense to have a good plan, as good as it can be. So if you provide more time to elaborate national recovery resilience plans, I don't think that is that much of a hiccup. The quality of the plan matters, but then the implementation of the plan is even more important. And here, I think we will see severe differences between the implementation capacity of member states to implement what they had put down on paper. And we will also at some point have changes of government. So that would also affect on the implementation capacity and willingness in individual member states.
Thank you very much. Marta, one last question to you before we bring in the element of the industrial strategy. And this relates to EU governance in this area, because we are now in a new era of big government. We're also in an era where austerity is off the table. Governments have been willing, we have seen both at national level and EU level, to pump enormous amounts of money into the economy, to be very interventionist. Do you believe that we will eventually go back to the governance of old, back to the old normal, as it were, or have things changed fundamentally, both in terms of the strictures of the Stability and Growth Pact and budget discipline, in terms of the attitude to the EU itself, borrowing? Do you think something has fundamentally changed, or when the crisis, immediate crisis is over, will we go back to our old ways, as it were?
I do think something has fundamentally changed. And I think going back to what we had before, it's impossible. So it's either going to be, we keep the same governance structure in different conditions. And so the governance structure will even be less effective than it was before. So that's really not an optimal solution. Or somehow the member states find the political will to revisit the governance structure and to make it more fit to the new conditions, and so improve effectiveness of its mechanism. And I think this is a right time to start discussing these issues, because as we've said, and as you've just mentioned, some member states have made an enormous change from a political point of view when it comes to what they really think about how the EU should economically work. Joint debt was something that many member states would have never not even discussed before the pandemic. And I think there is a realization that more and more what we have doesn't work, for example, when it comes to fiscal rules. Yeah. Some countries have always been saying that they're not implementable, they're not enforceable, from both ends of the spectrum. So I think now it's a good occasion to sit at the table and at least start discussing what a different framework could look like. And I think there is some chance that there is some
Thank you. Fabian, you wanted to come in, and let me just read out also at this point a question from Sylvia Kotanidis, who says, how do you assess the strictly COVID-related measures, SURE, EMS, etc.? How have they been used, by which countries? This, she says, is also part of the preparation to face future crises. Fabian, can you react to that and whatever you wanted to say? And then I want to move on to the industrial strategy.
I think in terms of the economic governance which we have, I think there's a danger that we end up with the worst of all worlds, that we all recognize that what we have at the moment isn't really working, is not really appropriate for the situation we find ourselves in. But because it's politically difficult, we end up not reforming it. So we continue to have a structure which doesn't work, and that does create problems in the longer term, because it also does create problems in countries which do feel that there's a need to have some form of structure. So having a structure which is effectively ignored, I think, is the worst of all worlds. So now is really the time, as Marta has said, to reform it. I think in terms of the question, I think we should have a very clear look at the measures we have put into place during this crisis, and assess them both in terms of how well they have worked to react to the crisis, but also in terms of are they longer term additions which might, or are they the basis of longer term additions to our economic toolkit, which might be helpful for the future. I think having some form of automatic stabilizer at the European level, which can help us address these kind of crises much quicker than we have up to now, is something we should be thinking about. And again, this is the time now to think about these things.
Absolutely.
Not at the time when the next crisis.
Okay, let's move on to the industrial strategy. Before I do that, I will read out a remark from Dimitri Gorbakis, who says, while there is no doubt that recovery and resilient plans have a globally positive impact, closer scrutiny reveals a very patchy planning with no real strategy for investment choices, and in many cases, hugely conventional ideas. Unfortunately, except for the green and digital transitions, there is little consistency with the major policies of the Union. I suspect this is something we'll come back to as those analyses of how the plans square up in different areas continues, and as we get the other 13. We only have, as Marta said, half of them so far. But let's move to the revised industrial strategy. And Frederico, if I could come to you first. You and Marta wrote a joint policy brief back at the end of March, where you said that the industrial strategy needed to, and I quote, adapt to the post-pandemic world's challenges. And you called for the design and implementation of its mechanisms to be strengthened. You made a number of key recommendations in 4 areas. What's your reaction to the updated strategy that was published last week? Is it significant? Does it take us much further forward? And were you pleased or disappointed?
I think it is significant. I mean, we have to realize that it's an update, not an entirely new strategy. It's broadly in line with the direction set out in the March 2020 strategy. And it's responding to a set of challenges and vulnerabilities that were revealed through the process of the COVID pandemic, as well as a number of more geo-economic challenges that have really come to a head at the same time, primarily the challenge from China and the peculiarities of its state-led economic model. In terms of what's significant within it, I'd kind of point to a few key bits. One is the review of the strategic dependencies, which is a new element, and I think we can expect to see that as a regular feature. I think the other one is the proposal on foreign subsidies, which is, I think, technically separate from industrial strategy, but it was presented at the update and is kind of intrinsically linked to how we define open strategic autonomy and how the Union reacts to distorted foreign subsidies on our internal market and on our companies. I think there were some other interesting bits in terms of, I think it was the first big application of the 14 industrial ecosystems framework for analyzing the structure of the European Union's economy and what's necessary. But I think in other terms, there's quite a few things that were promised, but haven't yet come. So, for example, a standard strategy, which will be critical, not only for the internal functioning of the internal market, but also has greater international dimensions now that we see, for example, China taking a much greater role in international standard setting, which will impact the competitiveness of European companies abroad. We saw mentions of a single market emergency instrument to respond to the dimensions that, the disruptions that we saw during COVID, but no clear idea what that looks like yet. And mention of things like transition pathways within the ecosystems for the green and digital transitions, but as yet not entirely clear what exactly that will entail in the regions.
That was quite striking because we had, on the one hand, we have Internal Market Commissioner Thierry Breton saying the real industrial revolution is starting now. On the other, we had Christian Eller, MEP, and the EPP saying this leaves much to be desired. It's not clear, it's not mature. And you talked about promises that weren't there. What is the key challenge now, the key implementation challenge as we move forward? Frederico again, and then I'll come to Marta.
So, in defense of the industrial strategy update, I think some of the key mechanisms had already been outlined in the original strategy, and they were simply reiterated in the update, like the use of important projects of common European interest to channel member state subsidies to new and innovative industrial ventures, the use of industrial alliances to coordinate private investment, which have had success in the past, but like with the battery lines, which are now being rolled out to new sectors. So I wouldn't poo-poo the update too much just because it's building on what was there before. In terms of implementation, I think one of the greatest challenges will be to coordinate the various different sources of official support, the different funding pots, to make sure that they are properly aligned with the objectives of the strategy and the European Union's wider green and digital ambitions, because you have the Recovery and Resilience Fund, you have cohesion funding, you have Digital Europe, you have Horizon, you have InvestEU, as well as other bits of the EIB's lending mandate, all of which can be coordinated to support these ventures and which have been coordinated in the past. But a lot of it is in the hands of member states, like the recovery and resilience plans.
Absolutely.
So
and of course, come back in a little while. We were talking about Porto and the social summit earlier, whether this new industrial strategy reflects a greater emphasis on the social side or not. And I've heard criticisms of poor linkages between this and Horizon Europe. So the whole question of joined up thinking. But Marta, your overall assessment, Frederico, broadly positive. Yes, a lot of challenges to come, but it is significant. It is a key moment. Would you share that assessment?
I do, but I want to add something that for me is quite disappointing and that I was missing in the original strategy from last year and still missing this year. There's two things. One, I think that inclusiveness is missing. The strategy and the update, I believe, are very much skewed towards cutting edge sectors, to the innovation frontier, which of course is very good to boost the European standing also and international competitiveness in new sectors, new technologies. But we should not forget about the large majority of industrial actors and sectors that still need to go through industrial transitions and adapt to new ways of economic structures and a new way of trade and all of that. So I really think that the strategy lacks the inclusiveness of the large majority of those who are not at the cutting edge, but still need to go through enormous change.
So the answer to my question about Porto is it's not reflected. That emphasis we now see on just transitions and so on, it's not there for you.
I think the strategy, it's easy to talk about just transition when we talk about developing hydrogen and new clean technologies, but it's not just about creating this space, which of course need to be there, but we should not forget things like technological adoption, the digital divide, which is a huge component of a successful industrial transition, and which for me are not adequately mentioned in the strategy nor the update. And the second point that disappoints me and relates to this is a lack of territorial sensitivity, which is there needs to be a consciousness that the baseline for industrial transition is not the same across the European Union. Not every region, country, city or rural area is at the same point to engage with the structural changes. And so a comprehensive and inclusive strategy should acknowledge this and take it into account, which instead I'm not seeing this. I'm not seeing a targeted approach to ensuring successful transitions across territories, and I think this is risky, because if we focus only on the best in the class without taking into account the left, the 80% that's left, I'm not sure about the long-term sustainability of these changes.
Thank you, Frederico. I'll give you a chance to react to this shortly, but I just want to bring Fabian and Janis in for your overall assessment of this new strategy, and does it fit the bill? Does it meet your expectations, Fabian?
Yeah, I think given that it is in line with what was published last year, and also I think it does take into account the changes which have come with COVID, I think it is positive. But Marta and Frederico have already highlighted some of the areas which are, I think, more questionable. I think what for me is going to be the big test is going to be the delivery of this. And we are going to be in a situation where, as we have done before, we have very good aspirations. But can we actually make them happen on the ground? Not least because a number of the actions will have to take place at member state level, not at European level. So we need to actually see the member states delivering on this. And I think there are very different capacities, but also different willingness between the members. I think the other big question I have is whether we have done enough to overcome the silo thinking. Have we actually integrated policies right across the spectrum? there are a number of crucial areas which I think have been mentioned within this update, but we still don't know in what direction we're going to go. Just to mention one of those, the review of competition policy, which has been on the horizon for quite a while now, but we still don't know what that is going to look like and whether that is going to fit in with this strategy or whether it's going to be a separate one. I think it also skirts around some of the problems which we have at the moment. We have enormous amounts of state aids in some countries going into industry, which depends a lot on the fiscal capacity of those countries. What impact is that having? And there's an assumption within the update which says, well, we'll return back to normal at some point in time. Now, I would question that. I'm not sure we will ever return back to normal. So we need to find new ways of dealing with this situation, but it shouldn't be a free-for-all. So there are still a number of questions which need to be answered.
Thank you. Janis, your overall assessment, and if you could pick up on this point that Marta was making, because I want to link it back to what you said earlier about Porto, about the inclusiveness, about what she calls territorial sensitivities. Do you see reflected, and it links to Fabian's point about silo thinking, do you see reflected in this strategy an awareness? It says it's talking about the post-COVID reality and is updating to the post-COVID reality. Do you believe it really is?
Let me start with the overall picture. And I think that, one, it is good that we're having this discussion, that we have the last year's strategy, that we have the update of the strategy. But all the reasons and all the deficits which were mentioned by Marta, by Frederico, but also by Fabian, with respect to implementation challenges, with respect to the level of inclusiveness, which includes various different dimensions of inclusiveness, if you look at that. The lack of comprehensiveness, which Marta was referring to, but also the question of targeted support or not sufficiently targeted, having targeted support, I think relates to a bigger issue which we're having. And the bigger issue is that there are strong economic national interests which are competing with each other in a situation where, and you were quoting Bertrand earlier, where the real industrial revolution is still ahead of us. And we're seeing that member states, also the strongest of member states, are struggling with the new situation and with the developing situation. And I think that that will make it also difficult among Europeans to cooperate in terms of not only defining a strategy, agreeing on a strategy, but then actually implementing it in practice. The member states are so much under pressure that they are looking first and foremost of how they can themselves ensure that they will get out of this industrial revolution in the best way. And there is this inclination of predominantly looking at the national level. Yeah. And that relates to the second question you were posing with respect to the social dimension, the social component of all this. If you look into proposals coming from the Commission with respect to, for example, minimum wage, but also other proposals which have been presented, it's the member states which have a lot of member states which have a problem with that. They do not want to go in that direction. They do not want that the EU is stronger in these areas because they believe that this could, at the end of the day, undermine their ability to deal with what we're having in front of us, which is a major industrial revolution happening in front of our eyes. And that, I think, is the fundamental challenge which we're facing. And what we're now doing is technical engineering for a fundamental political problem which we're having.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of inputs from the audience. One, talking about when we talk about silo thinking, should the industrial strategy be better coordinated with the European Innovation Council work plans? A bit too detailed for our discussion now, but an interesting point. And also linking to what Marta was saying about arguing that there is a lack of real mechanisms for linking the bottom-up business community and the reality of Europe's regions with the sort of top-down alliances that it talks for, and therefore the questioner thinks it'll be more of a business as usual scenario. But Federico, your reaction to what you've heard in terms of some of the disappointments that Marta was expressing, but also if I can bring in, because we don't have long, another element, which is, and you mentioned it earlier, the review of strategic dependencies. Is a lot of emphasis on saying we need to know more about our dependencies, we need to assess this, we need to analyze it. How do you see this strategy fitting into the broader open strategic autonomy debate?
So I wouldn't disagree with any of the points that Marta made, and I think that's why it'll be interesting to see how the issue of transition pathways, which are sort of very briefly sketched out in the update, develop, because that could be one mechanism in which we get a much more developed, sort of detailed approach for this issue of technological adoption for the transitions and territorial targeting. When it comes to the issue of strategic dependencies, and sorry, did you say open strategic autonomy, or was that one?
Yes.
I think it does advance it. I mean, it means it puts in place a process by which we can regularly review and update our understanding of Europe's strategic dependencies. How we address them, I think, is still an open question. I think the language of the update indicates that the preferences for a kind of industry-led approach in the first instance, but it will very much, I think, depend and vary from item to item, really, depending on the particular industrial structure and what the vulnerability is and what the bottlenecks are that are causing this vulnerability or concentration in a particular country. I think what was quite encouraging in the update, and it was something that we also had in our recommendations, was that there was an acknowledgement that dependencies can be mutual, that it's not just one way, that, you know, there can be areas where other countries are reliant on the European Union, and that is a mutual interdependency that you can leverage. So it's not just about trying to get rid of any potential single dependency, looking at it in and of itself, but it's part of a whole system of international trade, and the importance is to make sure that the system isn't sort of turned against us and that it can be leveraged both ways.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you all in a sentence or so each in the couple of minutes we have left in a moment to give me your key next step. Where do you think we go from here? But just to read out a comment from Alison Hunter, Janis's point about the influence of national interest also exposes a significant weakness in national EU competitiveness. She says, if we cannot address the innovation and digital divide in member states, we don't stand much chance of success internationally. So for each of you, and literally we have 3 minutes left, so it's going to have to be very brief, and I'll go in reverse order this time. So Janis, key next step for you in terms of addressing the issues we've been discussing and making sure that this new strategy really does contribute in the way that the Commission originally intended?
I think that what we need to do, and this was already mentioned, but I'll just reiterate it, is that we put the industrial strategy and also other aspects we discussed in the second part of our update into a wider perspective. And we need to have this discussion now. Because if we're trying to have it later on, I do not think that the situation will be easier to get a compromise among the EU 27. We are still under the impression of the COVID-19 crisis, which I think helps in order to make sure that we take certain decisions collectively which point in the right direction. And if we think ahead a year or 2 years ahead, I think we will be under circumstances economically and potentially also politically, which will make things not easier, but probably more difficult.
Thank you very much. Fabian.
I think the key thing is addressing some of the shortcomings, continuing to adapt the crisis also to the developing economic crisis, which we have with COVID-19. But what I would mostly emphasize is delivery. Too many times in the past, we've had this where, for example, one area we haven't talked about very much is single market standards, where we have made these kind of commitments, where we have very good objectives, but when it comes to actually delivering it on the ground, we've fallen short. Are we going to see a significant advance, for example, in standard setting, in terms of services in the single market, in terms of a number of the issues there? Are we going to see that we address our strategic dependencies, not just analyze them, but actually take steps to do something about them? Or are we simply going to be back in a year's time, 2 years' time to say, well, these are all good things we should be doing, but we haven't really done them?
Thank you very much. Frederico.
I mean, I very agree with Fabian that the implementation is key. I mean, at some point, you just really have to go on and do it. Worry about the specificities of an optimal design a bit later. None of these things are ever fully optimal, but it's important to implement what we've already committed to. And in that sense, I think that making sure all the different funding pots and European programs where there is a European lever are well aligned.
Thank you very much. Marta, you have the final word.
I won't add anything to this, but I'll tell you what the next step for the recovery is, which is that national parliaments should ratify the own resources decision. Otherwise, all of this was for nothing, and the plans will never get funded.
Thank you very much to all four of you for a great discussion. We will come back, I'm sure, on all of these issues again, but that is all we have time for this week. Just to highlight a couple of publications. There is a piece coming out this week on anticipatory democracy. Sounds intriguing. Look forward to read that. Also, just to say, in the area of industrial policy, the EPC now has a dedicated website page that collects all its work in this area together. I mentioned the policy brief from the end of March that Frederico and Marta wrote. There's lots more there. Please do take a look. Lots of events coming up next week, far too numerous to mention now. Janis, Fabian and I will be back at the end of the month with the next update. So it only remains for me again to thank all of you, to thank our audience. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I wish you a pleasant rest of the day and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.